Great. Well, morning, everybody, and thanks, Tom, for that intro. I've uh, I've called this masterclass "Beyond Being Intimidated: Curriculum Development Made Doable," and I think when Tom and I and Mary set out on these a couple of years ago, I was maybe 2.5 years ago. I was working really hard on learning lots about the curriculum, and it seemed incredibly intimidating to me. Um, and you kind of wonder why. It got me wondering why I hadn't done this 20, 30 years ago. But I've learned unbelievable amounts in the last 2.5 years about the curriculum, and working with people like Tom and Mary and meeting so many brilliant people along the way has helped me understand the curriculum much better. And so this one's called Beyond Being Intimidated. I just want to kind of discuss what that means and where that's come from. Oh, something's happened here. Escape that one. So let's begin with that slide. I think that's so important to understand as senior leaders, that actually one of the main jobs that's largely not done by senior leaders is helping subject leaders develop the curriculum. I talk with some people and they talk about holding subject leaders to account for the curriculum. That's such the wrong language. The language is about supporting teachers and supporting subject leaders to develop the curriculum subject by subject. But there's some huge issues around making that happen. And I think one of the big things for me is our job is quite clearly to make this unbelievably complex thing as simple to do as possible, but it is really complex. I was just talking with Tom before we came on air about Sonia's session yesterday, and just how deep and profound the thinking is that goes on when you're thinking about what to include in the curriculum, when you've got to make really difficult choices. So what I'm not proposing is making it simplistic. But what I am proposing is that senior leaders need to be able to make as simple as possible, as easy as possible, teachers and subject leaders to do the curriculum development work, because they are the experts, and remove all the barriers they can from them doing that work, and remove the intimidation from doing that work, because doing the curriculum development work does seem like a huge thing for them to have to do. And I put those numbers up there because I think this is at the root of some of the things I want to say today. And 600 is the number of people roughly who turn up to Research Ed in September at the national conference. And 500,000 is the number of teachers in the country. So 0.12% of teachers turn up to Research Ed. And there's probably an even lower percentage of teachers who are as into it as I might be, is into the curriculum development, into teaching and learning, the whole thing, being into education. And I think what we have to remember is that people have lives outside of education, other things to do. And for many people, when you've got it's a mass employment profession with 500,000 people in teaching. You're going to have a full range of people who are at one end of the spectrum, geeky about it every day. Other end of the spectrum, it's a job, I get paid, there are other things on my life. So you have to remember that. But everybody, that's one way or another, will be, of those 500,000, will be involved in curriculum development, and we just have to remember the numbers. So this is, I think, the problem. This is the problems for senior leaders when they're trying to develop the curriculum with their subject leaders and teachers. I think that's the first one. Some of the terminology can be incredibly intimidating and complex. I think that's true too. How much do we know about curriculum design? I would suggest not very much. And then one of the biggest problems is this one: having a thorough knowledge of the subjects we line manage. I make out that I know lots about lots of subjects, but I probably know tiny amounts. So I'll go into a biology class and spout on about mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, but that's about all I know. And I did begin A-level biology at one point back in the day. I think I can cite the respiration or the photosynthesis formula, but not much more than that. So there's a big issue around how much do scene leaders know about this, the subjects that they line manage, and if they don't know that much, how can they actually support people to develop the curriculum? Now, there's a quotation. I'll give you a few seconds to read. It's a really interesting quotation about the curse of impenetrable terminology. I won't say who that's by, but the person is highly regarded in education. And that's what that person said, that we've got to meet middle leaders where they are. We've got to meet teachers where they are. And some of what is said about the vocabulary that's used about developing the curriculum can put people off. I began the first ever masterclass presentation I did with a quotation from legitimation code theory, which a few people laud on Twitter, in the Twitter sphere. I just didn't understand a word of it. I found it almost impossible to penetrate and understand. I just gave up with it. I just didn't need it to be someone who's developing the curriculum. So we have to be really careful about the language. And I've been working at Huntington to make sense of the language that we hear. There's lots of the vocabulary there. And I've coloured them together because they usually go together. Some of that's really interesting. I've done a presentation on core knowledge and hinterland knowledge, coming from Christine Council, threshold concepts. We all know, we all have come across that language, but for the majority of people, it's really difficult to understand, and it can be quite intimidating. So I've been working really hard. I'm doing lots of development work at Huntington in my last few weeks. I've got a presentation to do next week, a third one to do next week, to subject leaders. And I'm trying to pare down the terminology we need. So we have a common terminology. And I came to this. So that all I've come with is three terms. So the first one, lots of you will know, the substantive. Really straightforward. And then the procedural. And even when I got to procedural, I've used strategies rather than skills. And there's a paper with a link to, there's a link to the paper where this is differentiated. And there's the differentiation between a skill and a strategy. And I kind of like strategy better than skill when you look at it like that. So substantive, procedural, and then the final ones, the control strategies, the control knowledge, knowing what to do when what you think would work doesn't work, often called metacognitive. And I think these are really important. And so last night I was in conversation, Zoom meeting, just with Mary Meyer, and we were chatting through, and I was showing her some of the slides for today and getting excited about it. And she said, but John, they're not fear-free terminology. They are scary for lots of people. And they're not straightforward. And I've worked really hard to get this to be this straightforward and this clear. And of course, and then she says, and in history, the disciplinary is really important. And that's not on there at all. And so I just got really sad, thinking, what do I do? She said, just use the word stuff. So I came up with this, just knowing that, and why you want them to know that. Just what's the stuff that you want students to be able to know, understand, and do by the time you finish teaching them. And I was mucking about this morning with it, and Mary thought that was perfect. And there'll be a lot of relieved people in my presentation today, happy that the substantive, the procedural, and the control knowledge has been replaced by stuff. And you can tell me, you can feedback, please feedback in the chat as to whether I'm dumbing down too much. I'm really not dumbing down, because I think this is all really, really complex and really interesting. But let's stick with a bit of stuff for the moment. We know what that means when it's coming to the curriculum, and it's knowing why you're including that stuff and want them to learn that stuff that is the key thing. So, and this is what we've interviewed Claire Hill. Mary and I have interviewed Claire Hill, and I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. Claire Hill, who co-wrote with Kat Howard Symbiosis, which I think is a brilliant book on the curriculum. If you haven't read Symbiosis, please do. It's a brilliant book. And when we had an interview with Claire, and she said it was just an amazing interview. And I was, if you look up the word, the meaning of the word, if you look up the word awe, I was awestruck by just how good she was when she was talking about being I think she's an assistant head in terms of in charge of the curriculum across a mat. Just brilliant. And that's, without any prompting from me, that's what she said about how you have to be really sensitive about the language that you use and how not to intimidate people. It was brilliant. So her suggestion is that, you just got to judge where people are and what people know, and keep asking them questions and keep supporting them, and introduce some of the terminology, explain what it means, but without intimidating anybody. So brilliant, brilliant, brilliant stuff. So that's the key thing about terminology. I think it comes down to the Claire Hill thing when it comes to senior leaders, is meet people where they are and then bring them up, and have conversations about the terminology. So you just make sure you're both speaking about the same thing. And when it comes to principles, I mean, you can do all sorts of stuff, but this little booklet by Dylan William, it's really good, and it's free, and it's there aren't many pages, and it's big print, big font. I would highly recommend, if you're worried about understanding curriculum design and when the principles of curriculum design, Dylan Williams' little booklet published in 2013 has stood the test of time, and is as good as it's ever been. So I'm not going to spend any more time on curriculum design matters, because you can download that, read it, and it gives you a good sense of the things you're thinking about when you're designing the curriculum. So I want to get back to some of the problems. One of the things that I've done to get to know much more about the curriculum, and to get my colleagues thinking about their curriculum and thinking about the stuff, is based around this paper called Cognitive Apprenticeship in Action. And some of you might have heard me talk about it before. I'm going to talk about it a little bit today, because I think my thinking's moved on a little bit since we published this book a few months ago. But the germ of this book came when 6 or 7 years ago, back in, I think, 2014, 2015, when I had a group of economics students, and they took their mock in February, and they got largely the most popular grade my AS economics students got in their mock was a grade U. And I knew they knew the economics, but I couldn't get them to find the economics to answer the questions on the mock exam paper. So I went away. Alex Quigley showed me this paper called Cognitive Apprenticeship in Action, and essentially I went back into the room a week later. The students had learned no more economics, but I showed them how to think through answering a paper and got them to write it down using a visualizer. They took another paper, and the average improvement was 3 AS grades, and one lad went from a U to an A overnight without learning any more economics. He was just able to apply what he'd learned to the questions because I'd shown him my thought processes. And essentially what we're after is this thing back in 1945 that Gilbert Ryle identified, and it's the difference between knowing how to use your knowledge and just knowing something, knowing that and knowing how. And knowing that is a problem if you don't know if you don't know how to do things with it and how to apply it. And that's the nub of Gilbert Ryle's address. So my AS level students knew lots of stuff, but they didn't know how to use it. They knew lots of economics that I taught them, but they didn't know how to use the economics. And I love that sentence there at the end. A silly person can be stocked with information, yet never know how to answer particular questions. And so I asked her, I kind of thought this paper was great. And it comes around again to the know, understand, apply stuff, which is what I think we are kind of addressing here. If you have a successful curriculum, at the end of that successful curriculum, you ask the question, what do your students know, understand, and can do or apply if you've taught a really rich, challenging curriculum. So there's the paper by Collins, Brown and Holland. You can download it. You can see it's actually in the book. It's an appendix to the book. It's that short, and the book's really short and pithy. And this is what they say, essentially. It's about bringing tacit processes into the open. And it's about making thinking visible. So the whole issue around it is, can we make thinking visible for our students, expert thinking visible? And the paper has 4 dimensions. And what I really like about the paper, and I really like it's really clear in the book, what I love about the paper is that it's a whole package, and you can pick bits from it and to tweak your teaching. But it covers every facet of what you want a good learning environment to have. So it begins with a type of knowledge and content, several methods that you'd use to get people thinking clearly, how you do tasks and sequence them in order to maximize learning, and then the sociology of the thing. So what's it look like if you've got the right community and the right atmosphere in the classroom to be successful? So those are the 4 types. And in a longer presentation, I go through each of the 4 dimensions and illustrate them with a subject. But I'm just going to go to sequencing. And I want to show in sequencing the mental processes involved in learning. And this time it's in, of all things, it's in food. This is the question I asked the head of food. Okay. How do you think like an expert in your subject? And his name's Gary, he's brilliant. And we had an amazing conversation back and forth about thinking expertly in his subject. And he would come back and say, well, it's modeling. I said, well, everybody says modeling. What is it specifically about food and nutrition that makes food and nutrition unique, and the thinking processes in it unique? And I'll show you what he came up with in a second. And then I asked him, how do you make that visible? And then I asked him, how do you teach it? And in brackets there, you can sit down. It's a brilliant exercise to do. Sit down and answer those questions within your department, within colleagues in your school, for whichever subject you want to choose. In the book, every single national curriculum subject is covered. So this is dimension 3. These are the 3 areas of dimension 3, which I'm going to illustrate now. Global for local, increasing complexity, increasing diversity. I'm going to show you those as Gary has done them in food. So thinking like an expert food teacher, or a food expert, a food practitioner, thinking like really a chef. Gary says, there he is doing a brilliant demonstration during lockdown. I think he's making an omelette there. This is what he says, and he talks about a disciplinary principle in food science teaching: is think like a scientist and demonstrate like an artist. But more wittily and more interestingly, he uses this, which is almost like a Chinese proverb: rescue a lumpy sauce to send a student home with a decent macaroni cheese. Teach a student about gelatinization and they'll perfect sauces for life. I love that. So what Gary brings when I really pushed him to think about what you need to be a brilliant chef and the thinking, he came up with 3 things. First one, when he really thought about it, that when you're being a really good chef, you're thinking 3 steps ahead all the time, because certain things have to be done at certain times. You have to think really clearly and anticipate, and have things planned 3 steps ahead. In real-time thinking, Gary illustrates that when he's demonstrating, and I'll show you how he does it. Secondly, when you're thinking like a chef, you have all your senses alert to what's going on. And that's because you're anticipating danger all the time. You can have a look in the oven to see if what's happening to the food. You may be waiting, you're hearing, waiting for a buzzer to go, because that's the time to turn an oven on or turn an oven off, take something out. You're always using taste to see what's happening. You're always maybe having to touch some of the food. I'm always amazed when I watch food programs how much the chefs actually physically touch the food with their hands. And of course, you're always smelling what's going on. So second thing Gary said, beyond being 3 steps ahead, was actually you have to train students to have all their 5 senses alert all the time when they're cooking. And then lastly, the last thing is about how to apply and understand your knowledge and your ingredients. And to comprehend what's going on, you have to know the science of the ingredients. You have to know what's happening scientifically to them. So if you know that, then you can anticipate what's going wrong and you can intervene before it's too late and you have to put the food in the bin. So Gary then takes you through, and this is how he teaches students how to think like a food technologist, an expert one. This is what he does. So he articulates, well, I've watched him do this so many times. It's an absolute joy to watch him teach. The 3 steps ahead thinking all the time. And he comes out, it's very clear, this is what he's doing, and this is how he's thinking. And he kind of comes out, he almost kind of stands outside of himself to talk about why he's thinking what he's thinking. And then when he's doing his explanations of the how and the why the ingredients work together, he talks about their scientific properties. And that's really, really important. So there you've got starch, gelatinization. And I've watched him teach the students, and he has a complete mixed range of prior attainment in his classroom. Watched him teach the language and the knowledge just superbly well. So they have to know the science of the thing. Then really good questions. I love that question. What else will I need to do in 2 minutes if this souffle is not going to go saggy in the middle? Why? No one likes a saggy souffle. He then also, when he's doing something, articulates what he's doing and provides clear visualization of what he's doing. I love, when you watch him pick up an omelette with a spatula, he really is clear about exactly how to do it so he doesn't break the omelette up. And then he's brilliant at verbalizing what he does in terms of taste and smell, but making it diagnostic. And there's a really good example there too. So what that conversation between me as a senior leader and Gary did was just asking some really good questions based on that piece of research by Collins et al. About what thinking like an expert in food and nutrition really meant. And it's been remarkable. So in the book, there is a page for every subject in the curriculum. This is what Gary thinks. This is his conclusion. He says, until I discovered Collins's paper, I found it difficult to articulate how we teach students how to cook. When I first asked him that question, he couldn't answer it. But thinking about the principles of cognitive apprenticeship provide me with a framework to explain in tangible terms how food teachers seemingly sprinkle magic dust over a year 7 student who has had little experience of cooking, maybe making rice crispy cakes with grandparents, and transform him or her into an independent, confident, and increasingly expert cook who can make 3 complex dishes for the GCSE practical examination. So it's really good. It's certainly helped me understand food nutrition better, and it's helped Gary become a better teacher of it. So there's something there around the senior leader having the humility to ask really challenging questions and getting the subject expert to articulate what it is that they're doing when they're trying to get students to think like an expert. And it's been super. It's been a super piece of work at school. What's really nice is that at the end of it there, Collins et al. Say, it's not a package. You can't just download it off the shelf. It is something you can take bits of and make it your own, depending on what your domain of teaching is. But I'd recommend it hugely. It's a great to dip into. No chapter, because Tom and I were very strict about word count. So only 1,250 words per chapter, but every single word counts. So that's one thing I've done. Ask my subject leaders and ask experts in the school, how do you teach to think like an expert? Second half of this presentation then takes me into completely new ground, and I think this is these are the problem for subject leaders, phase leaders at primary, when they're asked to do a curriculum review and develop the curriculum. I think they're equally intimidated by some of the terminology. Quite often they think they have to start from scratch and chuck the baby out with the bathwater, and you really don't. I don't think they've got the resources. A lot of the time they don't have the resources for the ideal curriculum. And then lastly, and the thing I want to address for the next 30 minutes or so is senior leaders who don't know the subjects. And we know, don't we, that Vivian Robinson so clearly says, if you're never going to be trusted as a senior leader, especially supporting curriculum development, if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't understand the curriculum. You're working with someone who's an expert in that subject curriculum, and they are unlikely to trust you or take any notice of what you've got to say if you're not perceived as being knowledgeable and competent. So there is an onus upon upon senior leaders to do some work. And I want to talk to you about the problem of Cherry. Now, Cherry is our subject leader for modern languages. And Cherry has double first from Cambridge in Russian and German. And she's got brilliant skills, understanding of pedagogy. She's the real deal. She's the best subject leader in modern languages I've ever come across, I've ever worked with. And I line manage modern languages. So my main job is to support Cherry as she develops the curriculum. Now I've got a CSE grade, for those of you who know what CSEs are, I've got a CSE grade 1 in German. So my history of I got that in 1980, so I got that 41 years ago. And I know that Ik war met dem Zug nach Brighton means I travelled by train to Brighton. And that's about as far as it goes. I know that gegen means against and gegenüber means opposite. So how on earth can I help Cherry develop the curriculum? There's two issues here. One, I don't know enough about languages to help her develop the curriculum. And two, she could tell me anything and I would believe it's good, because I have no way of challenging her in a supportive way of knowing whether that's any good or not. So I remember I had a mate who told his mum once, when he came home from university, he was doing a triple honours in fluid dynamics, recreational pharmaceuticals, and celestial mechanics, which essentially was drinking, taking drugs, and playing Space Invaders. And his mum thought that was brilliant. It's a bit like the theology advert, if you're old enough to remember that. So I can't help Cherry because I don't know enough about languages and how you teach languages. And this has been really, really bugging me, like really bugging me. And I've been thinking about how we do this. How do we ensure the senior leader is able to support the subject leader, they line manage, develop the subject's curriculum? So I've been thinking about it and thinking about it. And I put together a side of A4 and sent it to Tom and Mary, and we chatted it through. And in the end, Mary and I have been working to kind of solve this problem. And we think it's a two-way problem. We think that there is an onus on the subject leader to support the senior leader in understanding more about the curriculum. And I think the senior leader has a responsibility to do a lot of work to find out more about the curriculum. Obviously, you begin with the national curriculum and the programs of study there, but there's a two-way thing going on here. And it's largely, the onus is largely upon the senior leader to find out much, much more about the curriculum of the subjects that he or she line or they line manage, in order to bridge the gap in understanding, and in the end have much better conversations, about supportive conversations about the curriculum, and also to have the ability and the knowledge to understand what might be good and what might not be so good when developing the curriculum. So we've been having all sorts of conversations. There's a couple of conversations. There's Helen Slipper on the left there in a conversation with us. Helen Slipper is a brilliant head of science and biologist. And there's Mandy Lawson there on the right-hand side a few days ago having a conversation with us around English. And she's a subject leader of English. So we've interviewed on Zoom, I think around 16 or 17 people, maybe more than that now. Couple of senior leaders as well, and we've got one more interview to do, and they've been absolutely fascinating. We've got dance next week, but we've done every other subject you can think of, and it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And we've found people across the country who've been extraordinary subject leaders, and I've been so educated by the whole thing. I've learned more than I ever imagined I'd learn about curriculum development, but about the subjects. And it's been, for someone who loves learning like I do, it's been an absolute joy listening to these people reveal the expertise they have around the subjects. And I just wish, and if there's anybody out there listening today on the other side of Zoom who's aspiring to be a senior leader in schools, and maybe in your late 20s, early 30s, and going on to want to be a head teacher or a deputy head teacher, do this work now. Find out about the subjects now. Be interested in the subjects now, because I'm doing it. I've done it. I've got 15 days left of my career. And I've kind of done this 20 years too early. So please go out and find out as much as you can about the curriculum. Hopefully, some of the stuff that's coming out of this project will be helpful, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later, and how you can access the stuff the gold dust that we've been the gold that we've been unearthing in these conversations. But it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and I just wish I'd done it 20, 30 years ago instead of a couple of months before I finished my career. So these are the three questions. I kind of lead the sessions, and Mary listens and then provides critique of what happens. And I begin with that question. And of course, year 9 looks both ways. It looks towards GCSE, but also looks backwards towards primary, because what we found is, by asking that question, what the answers that we get are applicable as much to primary school as primary stage as to secondary and moving into GCSE and A level. Because for many students, if you're taking, I don't know, if you're studying art, the last lesson in year 9 may be the last art lesson you ever have. So we've we've emphasized massively how important it is that that the Key Stage 3 curriculum is the powerhouse of the curriculum. It's the intellectual powerhouse of the school curriculum, and massively important to get right. Certainly of the secondary curriculum. And there are some entitlements there that have long been kind of ignored, really, because of the accountability measures in secondary being at the end of Key Stage 4. And the Ofsted report, the 2015 Ofsted report, the wasted years, is still largely, the findings in that report are still largely true, unfortunately. So we focus really hard on Key Stage 3, and you guess what? You know, the subject leaders that we've spoken to are obsessed about getting Key Stage 3 right, because they realise if you get that right, Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 have a brilliant foundation to build upon. So that's the first question. I asked you if you've got 20 or 30 students in front of you, you've taught a really rich curriculum. What should they know, understand, and do? Second question is, if that's your destination, where did you begin? So we begin at the end at year 9, then we go back to year 7. How did you build it up from that point? And then one of the last questions I ask is, what would you like your senior leader to know about your line manager to know about your subject? And they weave around. We have about a 90-minute discussion. Last night's was around 90 minutes on drama with George Coles, which was absolutely stunning. And we unpick, engage, just talk about stuff. And at the end, I can come in, like yesterday, I came in, began at 7, tired as hell, and I end at 8:30, absolutely invigorated and energized by the kind of conversations we have. And the subject leaders have enjoyed them immensely. They tell us, you can tell they did. Why wouldn't you want to talk about your subject and I'd be asked about your subject for an hour and a half? And the joy of it kind of suggests that those conversations should be going on in school all the time. In many schools, they are. So I'm going to give you a taste of what we found and what people were telling us. And one of the recurring things that came out was just how these brilliant subject leaders think big picture about their subject and have a really strong, elevated view about how important their subject is to young people. So this is Dr. David Priest on geography. That's how he began geography. And I pick out that bit there about positionality within the world. When David teaches geography, he's teaching geography because he's on a mission. Right? He's on a mission to make these people in front of him just tremendous human beings, thoughtful citizens. It's just brilliant, education rather than schooling. And I love that differentiation between being schooled to jump through hoops and educating people. This is proper education going on here in the world of David Priest and in his geography. Just blown away by his chapter. And we spoke to Youssef down in Hammersmith, and Mary picked up on Youssef on Twitter. And Youssef had blogged about how he shapes his GCSE curriculum. Because one of the things we thought about a lot was how actually lots of people just follow the spec at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. But actually, and I've taught economics A-level recently, certainly the OCR spec is the wrong way round. And there's lots of stuff in it I'd change, and lots of threshold concepts that are not in the right place. So Youssef talked about in his blog, and we contacted him, and an hour and a half with Youssef was an absolute delight. And there's this, getting people again to think about their position in the world and ask certain questions around life that actually economics can answer. And every subject leader, bar none, thinks their subject is the most important subject on the curriculum. And they all argued really brilliantly that way. And then Manny Lawson on English. And Manny Lawson's English, you'll see it when it comes out, is a brilliant structure at Key Stage 3. How she weaves up in Alnwick, which is quite an isolated area of the country, a town in the country, but how she weaves really thoughtfully a whole different range of texts from around the world into their curriculum to give those young people up in Alnwick a view of different people's lives and what it's like to live somewhere other than Alnwick. It's just brilliant, and she's just superb. And then we talked about PE, and this was so striking with PE with Guy. You know, his mission about PE is then in the end, when these students become parents, they promote physical activity and sport. It's just, I'd never thought about it. I never thought about it as a reason for teaching PE, that actually you're thinking generationally down the line. So we had a brilliant talk with Guy about PE and about how you find different ways of measuring success in PE, and actually lots of the stuff around what the All Blacks talk about in legacy, about actually doing sport, learning about sport, learning about how to conduct yourself, learning about etiquette is a brilliant preparation for life. And certainly as a young golfer, I learned a lot about what it was like to behave properly, what it was like to converse with adults and be in a grown-up world. And some of them demystify stuff. I mean, I talk a lot about computer studies. I find it really hard to understand computer studies. I have no idea, for instance, what the science is behind you being able to hear me at the moment, see my slides on your screen. How does that happen? I'm sure Tom will be able to answer that, but I can't. So line managing computer studies and asking good questions about computer science, and being able to support curriculum development is pretty difficult when you don't know what you're talking about. So we spoke to Tristan Kirkpatrick, who works for a huge trust in the north, and is one of their consultants on computer science. And there you are. And what I loved about listening to Tristan is how at the end of the hour and a half with Tristan, I knew so much more about computer science, to the point where I could have a proper conversation with the subject leader of computer science, because I'd had that conversation with Tristan, and he could teach me what questions to ask, but also some fundamental understanding of computer science and what it is. And you'll also find, you see there at the bottom of Tristan's, that so many of the subject leaders we've spoken to can see the value of their subject across the curriculum and to other subjects. It's really, really interesting. And if you had the time, and I'm sure we can shape the time in our schools, and I think it's important that we do, then you could really get a curriculum, you could start a curriculum up where the interactions cross phase, cross subject would be tangible, meaningful, and enriching and enhancing. I love Hannah Pinkham on languages. Hannah Pinkham is working at Reach Feltham at the moment as their director of languages, and she's moving to the north. She's moving to Bradford, to the Dixon's Academy chain, to be their director of languages and research. And I love listening to Hannah. They've written the whole of their Key Stage 3 curriculum, eschewed anything that you can buy, and how they've written the whole of their Key Stage 3 curriculum based on, they do French and Spanish, based on 3 imaginary Spanish-speaking children, one in Mexico, one in Madrid, and one somewhere, 3 across the country, across the world, that speak Spanish, and the same for French. And what's great about it, the whole of the curriculum is based on them writing letters to each other. And so you get the text, and they've written, the team at Feltham have written these letters. They begin with the big text, as in Gianfranco Conti, and they break it down. They learn all the material in context, and the students get really excited in the 7 and 8, really excited about the next letter that's going to come along, and the narrative that these children have in their relationship and how the relationship develops. And through that, they unpick the the techniques of the language. They don't really worry too much until year 9, but unpicking it. What they really focus on is getting the children to speak it in a brilliant accent. So that was illuminating for me, and something I'd never come across before, and clearly really successful down there with Ed Venker down in Feltham. And we included classics, and at one point I got so excited in the classics conversation that I just said, look, why don't we just have a Key Stage 3 based on the classics? And what I loved about Lucy's conversations was that line there, celebrating the perceived uselessness of the subject, because there is so much brilliant stuff in it. And again, if you get the narrative right and you get storytelling right, it's amazing. I love the last line, Latin, the guilty secret of a student's weekly lessons. One of the things she's determined to do, and I think she's absolutely right in my experience of Latin, is make sure that Latin is not seen as an elitist subject, and make sure that anybody can access it. And you can imagine, kind of, because everything goes back to it, you could have a whole Key Stage 3 curriculum with every subject rooted in its classical background, and go from there. It's the kind of thing that I'd come up with if I was 37, not 57. And that's what I'd come up with, and then irritate the whole of my staff when I'm saying, oh, we're going to design a Key Stage 3 curriculum based on the classics, but it would be brilliant. There's Gary, and Gary's included in there. And I think we had a conversation with Gary for an hour, and thinking he made the differentiation in the practical subject, how he's really clear about what he wants students to know, understand, and do, and then the projects, the food making projects that he chooses are chosen so the skills can be developed on, kind of be hung on those projects, not the other way around. He doesn't go, oh, I want to make a souffle because it'd be fun. He wants to make a souffle because he wants these 3 skills to be taught. And he begins in year 7 with knife skills. He says, if you can't do knife skills, then you can't really do cooking. So they spend a lot of time at the beginning of year 7 working on students' knife skills, and they really do, from the very start, all the way through Key Stage 3, they cook. And then you've got some people talking about structures, and this is where I'm really interested in the language that we use around curriculum, the vocabulary that we use. And I've said the stuff, but there are some subjects that are very clear about the types of knowledge that you need, and one of them is history. So we had an amazingly illuminating conversation with Dave Hibbert and Kat Priggs on history, and they explained as clearly as I've ever heard it the difference between substantive, disciplinary, and substantive concepts. And they have, I think the idea about disciplinary knowledge is so woven into the content and the stuff of history, because you're asked to make those discerning judgments about and interpretations about the evidence in front of you, and your interpretations of history. It's the stuff of it. In a way, it would be quite extraordinary to find, and people are going to tell me they've done this, to find someone in a GCSE biology class or a Key Stage 3 biology class who makes a scientific discovery. But it's possible in history, maybe, for a student to have an interpretation of the evidence in front of them about a certain phase of history or certain moment in history, and have an original valid view of it. I'm going to get battered now by all the scientists in the audience, but I think it's possibly the disciplinary strand of history is so clear, and I think possibly influenced massively by the work of Christine Council, who's done so much work in this area, that actually the disciplinary knowledge is woven into the teaching of history and the study of history. So there was history. And then mathematics, Chris McGrain was just out of this world. He teaches in, I think it's Holyrood or Holywood School in Glasgow, massive school in Glasgow, subject leader of mathematics. He's done a lot of training work with Mark McCourt. And he really brilliantly outlined for us the three things that you want your mathematicians to be able to do. So it's procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and then finally problem solving. I love that line at the end. Being a mathematician is a way of being. It's a way of interacting with the universe. It's a way of thinking. That's what you're looking for ultimately. And what this gave people the chance to do was talk about what they saw as an educated student, rather than oh, you know, they need to be able to do this to get level 7 or something, grade 7. It was a brilliant, they've been brilliant conversations educationally. So there's Chris McGrain on mathematics. So these people are very conscious of the kind of knowledge strands and some of the language that skewed over earlier. You would have these conversations at that level. If you go back to what Claire said, you would have conversations about procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and problem solving. You would have conversations with Dave Hibbert and Kat Briggs about substantive disciplinary and substantive concepts. You would have those conversations because they're fluent and at the heart of their subject. And then David Gash on physics, recommended by Nikki Kaiser. I guess David's, we interviewed 3 scientists, a chemist, a physicist, and a biologist. And all 3 of them are head of faculty. But we asked them to talk about their individual discipline that they're expert in, and then how that relates to the others. And you can see, I guess if you're a physicist, you begin with physics. If you're a biologist, you might begin with a biology unit, but lots of them are very similar in that you begin with forces. Then you go into the particles, then the energy, which takes you then into sounds. You can see the logic of it. But what was great was that we were hearing the logic of curriculum design from people who do it every day, from the experts who are reviewing it every single day. Everybody had the highest expectations of their students. Genuinely, people say that sometimes, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, but they really did academically. And one of them, Liz Dunbar, who's head of music at Huntington, we interviewed Liz, just extraordinary musician and extraordinary stuff she gets out of students in terms of how academic a practice it is, how as an academic subject at Huntington, with the highest aspirations for every single student, and how I was really interested how everything is about sound. That's why it's in capital letters. She uses sound all the time, and I love what came through was how lots of stuff is derivative. We talked a lot about how Seamus Heaney talks about becoming a poet, and if you become a poet, the first thing you do is hear another poet's voice, and you say to yourself, oh, I wish I'd said that in that particular way, and then you start mimicking for that poet. For Heaney, it was Manley Hopkins, and then you develop your own kind of USP as an artist or a writer or a musician that way. But every single subject leader talked about how none of their students could actually do anything until they knew lots of stuff. They had a brilliant knowledge base on which to learn and which to base their own work on. And then we've spoken to a couple of, as I said, a couple of senior leaders and discussed support and challenge and the balance of support and challenge. And Tom Bolter, loved Tom Bolter, really thoughtful head of curriculum at the Riverside Trust in Oxfordshire. And that's what he says. There's the question. You can have holes for 6 weeks in year 8, but you've got to be able to justify it, and you've got to be sure that it hasn't already been taught in year 5. So he talks there about an SLT is a non-specialist who knows their stuff. One of the things we talked about a bit with Claire and Tom is whether at senior level on an SLT you should have one person in charge of all the curriculum, so just become completely immersed in every single subject, or whether you have line management of subjects distributed across the SLT. So, for instance, I'm an English teacher, trained English teacher. I line manage at the moment mathematics and modern languages. Is that the right thing to do? Or should you have one person who can dedicate all their time to understanding all the subjects and ask the questions? It's a really good, we didn't come to an answer, but it's a really good issue about structure. So there's Tom on challenge, and here's Claire on support. So this is how you instigate a conversation. You begin with the positives rather than what's not working, what is working, then find out what is working, tease out the principles of what's working, and then apply those to what's not quite as effective. And her chapter, her conversation was just incredibly useful and illuminating for me. And as I said, I was truly in awe. So these are the notions, these are the kind of patterns that are emerging from our conversations. I think every single one of them felt that their subjects were really important and educating students for life. Got to ask yourself if curriculum is king, if curriculum is so important, are we prioritizing it as a school at senior level? Every one of them was engaged. Everyone was energized by the conversations that we had. That's why you're doing it. It's probably true that we wouldn't be doing this massive focus on curriculum if it wasn't for the regulator. But ultimately, it should be going on all the time anyway. Found that really. There's Gail Brown, who's the CEO of the Ebor Trust in York, been really illuminated by this work, and it's a primary trust. And she thinks some of the stuff, I've shown her a few chapters, shown her David Priest's geography chapter, thinks it applies to primary as much to secondary. And then it's a never-ending process, which I'll come to in a minute. But those were the notions, and that's my strapline really. I think all our conversations that we're going to publish are the beginning of a debate. Not one. We're not saying this is what geography definitively is. This is what history definitively is. This is how you definitively shape a Key Stage 3 curriculum in physics or science. But what it is the start of a debate with some brilliant people who do know what they're talking about and do know their stuff. It's been amazing. All the videos will be going up on Mary's video stream on her video channel, Maya and Co. And we'll get those up there by the end of the summer. I think we've got some editing to do, obviously, but not much. They do have interruptions. They do have my in-laws phoning and the phone going off. They are very informal, and we do have some fun in them, but they'll be out there for you to listen to. And then we've got a book called Curriculum Conversations Between Subject and Senior Leaders coming out at the beginning of September. And that's what's going to be in them. Every subject chapter will have those 4 things. Really useful. But what I love about it is that it feels really authentic. It feels exactly the stuff of the practitioners on the ground. And we were looking for a name, and Mary, in her previous life to being in education, was a marketeer, and she told me about how she found Gallimonfrey to coherence and how she found the word Gallimonfrey for her book there on the curriculum. And so we were searching for an idea, and I'd come up with the idea about calling it the Janus Conversations, because Janus was the god with 2 faces looking both ways, and it felt like you were having conversations back and forward between subject leaders and senior leaders. And Mary quite liked that, but we were all the way through. Every single person we spoke to has said that we never stopped reviewing the curriculum. It's an ongoing process. It's an endless process getting the curriculum right. And Mary started calling it the curriculum being a never-ending story. So I typed into Google who was the god of endlessness. And the god of endlessness is an Egyptian god called Hu. Now, it might be, huh, question mark is my response every time I walk into a German class. Huh? But also it's, huh, is the God of endlessness. So kind of felt for us the right title of the book, because that's what Claire Hill says. You know, that's a quote from Claire Hill without any prompting. It's never going to be over. And there is, huh, the God, the Egyptian God of endlessness. Now, I've got a few more things to say just to wrap up. I think if you're setting up a curriculum review, then you need to be really clear what's up for grabs and what's not up for grabs, because you've got the national curriculum, okay, and you've got Ofqual, and you've got you've got the specifications for the GCSEs and A levels. And I was talking to Rob Coe recently, Professor Rob Coe, about it, and he said, you know, lots of people at Key Stage 4 and 5, the curriculum's determined for them. So actually, where have you got some space? Where have you got some flexibility? And I think you've got lots of flexibility at Key Stage 3, and in schools where the SATs are secure and performance in the SATs is secure, you've got some space. But we thought in terms of a Janus facing phase of the curriculum, Key Stage 3 looks both ways. You've got to know what's coming before, and you've got to know what's coming after. When we spoke to Helen Slipper about the science curriculum at her school, she did a survey of all the websites of the primary school, so she knew she mapped out what was happening at Key Stage 2 from in the 30 schools that come to her school. Her 30 primaries that partner into her secondary. So they could actually base some of their Key Stage 3 curriculum decisions on what was going on in the primaries and what the students were coming up with. So what's up for grabs, what's not up for grabs? I think if you define that very clearly as a senior team, it helps subject leaders make progress on their curriculum. And I think this is probably success, right? I think this is probably success. This is, if you've done a really good curriculum review, it might take 2 or 3 years. This is what it might look like. And if they can, if your subjects or your phase teams or your area teams can answer those, and that last one there, I think is brilliant. Michael Fordham's principle of letting the subject matter determine the pedagogy. You don't shoehorn styles of teaching into the classroom just for the sake of it because someone thinks you ought to. Let the subject matter determine the pedagogy. If you've got every department or every team able to answer those questions about those, and they've cracked that, I think you've probably had a really successful curriculum review. Those are the reciprocal questions to our subject leaders. They're the same things, but just turned around the other way. And I think they'd be really helpful, especially stuff about misconceptions. And there's a seventh question, and probably the most important question. I do admire the work of Mark McCourt a great deal, and this quotation comes from his book. It was part of a blog he wrote about the learning episode, but comes from his book about the building blocks of the curriculum and making sure they're in the right place. So ultimately, a really helpful question, and then you can ask this question and just sit back and listen. Is that why do you teach that to those students at that point in the scheme of learning? Right, very simple, but hugely revealing. I've got now just 3 slides where I think this is what school leaders need to do. And there's lots in here, and I won't spend much time on these. But I do think if you follow these lines, one of the best things we did, point 5, was set up the curriculum development group about 4 years ago. And I didn't get involved. I let Gary, who's the best middle leader we have, with the greatest expertise, lead it. And they really trust him. And so it's an incredibly thriving, healthy group who's done some brilliant curriculum development work because they're working collectively, not being done from on high, but from the bottom up. It's been brilliant. I think there's lots of stuff there. I mean, the stuff there about computer science there, the 5th one down again. We had Tristan in when our computer science results weren't very good and was really helpful. That's how I got to know Tristan. and some of the stuff in there about at times really important. And then some helpful stuff there. I think the fifth one down again is interesting to look at, looking at this the curriculum across connections across the curriculum, because I think what you've got to avoid is artificial contortions in order to make sure one thing lines up with another thing, or they choose X instead of Y just to fit in with another subject. You've got to, I think, acknowledge this the primacy of the individual subject leader and their area leader. And that last one, it's about, in the end, providing a challenging curriculum for all our students. So that was a tweet from a huge admiration for Adam Boxer. That was a tweet from a couple of months ago, 3 months ago. Things which are rapidly becoming fads: metacognition, dual coding, curriculum retrieval practice. Because people don't understand it, the implementation is forced, and it becomes a bad thing. I don't think Alan's being critical. He's just being realistic that people don't have a great understanding of curriculum development. For a long time, we've had the national curriculum that's been delivered onto us. People feel as though implementation is being forced because on high are worried about Ofsted, and those two things together with a lack of understanding and forced implementation end up with something that, developing the curriculum, what can be wrong with that? If schools are anything, it's what our students learn. But in the end, it can be a bad thing because those two forces together end up it being a fad, comes and goes. People wonder why on earth we were doing that 3 years ago. We're not doing it anymore. It's been and gone. So I replace that with this equation, which I think is a much more positive, life-enhancing one than Adams. And there it is. I think if we can get it really, or if we really understand it, we can really resource it well, especially in terms of time and model design implementation. I think it's a good thing for everybody. I think it's intellectually stimulating for our colleagues and brilliant for our students. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Brilliant stuff. So we just got a few minutes for questions. So I don't know if anyone's, I haven't got any questions in the chat at the moment. People, the normal thing, people have just been going, and I've just seen someone on Twitter saying, this is exactly what they needed right now. So that's great. Now, I think that's good. In fact, to be honest with you, if people have been following the journey from yesterday, you do have a sort of arc of kind of, like, and I do think it's a process. You need to know the ideas are there to some extent, like to sort of be challenged. So if you listen to Benny's talk yesterday about diversity and inclusion, you're thinking, wow, there's a lot to think about. but it does come down to pragmatism, doesn't it? You then need to think, okay, it does ultimately come down to the stuff, which is very good. It does, but the stuff has to be informed by the thinking. So I do like this idea that there's a thinking process. And then after that, you then do just have to make some choices. And if we overcomplicate it, it's not going to be easy, is it? So that's so interesting. I think this is an interesting comment here from Hannah. She's saying, sometimes not knowing the subject as line manager allows the curriculum leader to explain the curriculum in a cogent way. And that makes sense, doesn't it? So it's about, sometimes people say, how do you get to know it? I say, well, you start off by asking questions. You become knowledgeable by starting the process of exploring. You talked a bit about this with the people that you've interviewed. I mean, I know the heart is partly a joke of that kind of, what? So obviously we haven't had these things yet, but do you think it's important for schools to have this sort of coherent line management relationship over more than a year, or is it, how quickly can you get to kind of understanding?
So I think you can get, my aim is to get a really good understanding in about 3 hours, right? To enable you to then go and have a conversation over a year. So at least you've got a base understanding, a basic understanding of the key nuggets of a subject curriculum. that it's based on, and then you can just spend the year learning, right? And I think my view is that the subject leaders will really be delighted that you've made an effort to find out about the stuff, and they can have a conversation with you, which is both enriching for them. And I think Hannah's point is absolutely right. We discussed that last night with Helen Slipper about how useful it is sometimes to have someone who doesn't know about the subject, so you can explain it to them really clearly. And and if you can explain it really clearly, then you understand it. That's the Einstein thing, isn't it? I think. So I think we wanted a kind of crash course for anybody who's line managing a subject and knows nothing about it much at all, and then start from scratch. I didn't know, for instance, and I should know, but I didn't know that the reason we have maps is a colonial thing. When the gentlemen explorers clubs in the 1830s wanted to go to Africa, they needed a map to go and explore Africa and then colonize it. And they're hugely weight. It's a huge cultural weight around maps, which I knew nothing about. I made some flippant quip to David Priest, Dr. David Priest, about isn't it all just about maps and things, geography? And he destroyed me. It was really interesting.
But then you get into the whole thing about in terms of the stuff, and if you're trying to advise, then the questions about how does that fit in, exactly what should the students know, what's excellence in that area, and there are some generic questions about that. What does excellence look like? How do you know? And I always feel like you need to have counterpoints. So what else have you seen? So what choices have you made? So if someone says, I've chosen this book, you say, well, what have you chose that instead of? So these are kind of, you get a feel, you learn about the choice making, and then later that and okay, you've made that choice, and then you can sort of see whether that's being delivered well based on those choices. Because I know some people who are kind of pretty, they can talk a good game, about stuff, but it then does have to be delivered. So there is a bit of nerdery which can sometimes be misplaced, like it's over fussing.
Well, one of the things, Tom, that Claire Hill's brilliant about is that she says, I'll have a 10-minute conversation, and then I say, okay, let's take me to some classrooms where this is going on. I want to see it. I want to hear it. I want to experience it. I'm not interested in some fancy scheme of learning that's got all sorts of colors on it and fonts and pages. Like, just tell me, let's have a conversation. Let me go in a classroom. Let me feel this thing going on. And what's the difference between the curriculum on paper and the enacted curriculum in the classroom is absolutely key to anybody who's line managing a subject.
Here's a question from Rachel. She says, I really like the idea of curriculum development group for middle leaders. Does that include all subject leads in the group, and how often do they meet?
It's all subject leads and the assistant subject leads, and they meet half termly, 6 times a year, led by Gary, and they honestly, it's a powerhouse of the school, and I just let them get on with it. And Gary will ask me, I'm presenting to them next week, something based on what I've just done here, and because we want to set up another review of the curriculum for the next couple of years. I think post-COVID, we're going to get back again to the proper work, because we feel like we've just been surviving for 18 months. And we're going to launch it with the stuff that I've just been working on with Mary.
Yeah, brilliant. No, I think that's great. And, I think there's so much in this. One of my feelings is that, I mean, there's lots of levels of expertise, aren't there? That and everyone is trying to develop theirs. And sometimes I find, in any school with turnover and people just moving through the profession, sometimes you get some quite inexperienced people owning a curriculum area, especially in a primary school where they're non-specialist, and it's quite a big responsibility, and they need a lot of support to sort of find a way through, and sometimes a bit of guidance goes a long way. So if you're a line manager, if you're talking from this perspective, sort of helping them connect to other people and feel part of a community. And it's the same with like single subject teachers. I met some people the other day where we're talking about teams, and she was saying, well, hello, I am the music teacher.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't have a team. And when I get lumped in with PE and art, it's not always helpful, because our issues aren't exactly the same. There isn't the same thing of performance and composition in the same way exactly, and a knowledge base. It's just different. So that people, you have to respect these sort of specific kind of scenarios that people are working in, don't you?
Oh, Definitely. And we're talking to Lucy Cresswell. She says, I am the only classics teacher. There's only ever one person in the classics department. And that's really tough. But there's a brilliant, that's why you need to connect it up with all the subject communities around the country. So, the classics online gang is hugely supportive of each other.
Yeah.
So Twitter and social media has been amazing for that.
No, I think that's cool. It's one of the first things I think you need to do is sort of say, like, who are you connected to? Because that whole thing of the subject community and its influence on the curriculum. I mean, I might want to have an awesome history curriculum, but have a really skewed view of what that is. Whereas the history community that the history team is involved in might be much stronger placed for that to come. And they're saying to me, no, this is what history is.
Yes.
You just don't know. And I'm going, oh, wow, okay, tell me. But that's always heartening, isn't it? When you find someone who really knows because they are connected. It's the opposite to worry, when someone feels like they're kind of just making stuff up outside of any influence beyond the school. That can be, you end up with a kind of stale kind of recycling. Well, look, John, fantastic. Can't wait for the book. Great title. People are going to call it Hugh or something. What is it good for? It's going to be those things. We can play around with it. But thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to stop the recording now.